everyone. Good afternoon. I'm Miguel Pizarro. I am the Commissioner to the United Nations of the Interim Government of Venezuela. I am one of the members of the National Assembly who has been sentenced in the last year. I spent 2 months in clandestinity inside of the country, and now I'm in exile and I'm working from abroad, trying to explain the Venezuelan reality and also trying to open spaces for new voices and for new experience. In this space, calling the conscientious lens, I will have the opportunity to talk about the political, social, economical, and institutional crises that are going through in Venezuela. Today, we will have the company of Felipe Jácome, a well-known Ecuadorian documentary photographer who is right now working on a project called Caminantes, el Éxodo Venezolano, or in English, Walkers, the Venezuelan Exodus, a project who shows the Venezuelan reality of those who have been forced to leave the country and walking for days, even weeks, to reach to a final destination. Also, we will have Carolina Jimenez. She is part of Amnesty International. She is an Associated Director of Research for Americas, and also she's working in the regional crisis. She is part of the Coordinación Regional de Migrantes, and she has developed several articles about the Venezuelan human rights violation and the crisis in the country. Finally, I am very glad to introduce also Andrew Selee, President of the Migration Policy Institute in Washington, a non-partisan organization who seeks to improve immigration and integration policies through research, learning opportunities, and dialogue. I would like to begin with Felipe. You have been joining the Venezuelan migrants, especially the Caminantes or the Walkers. Could you tell us your impression when you met them, when you saw the harsh reality they are facing, and also what are your reasons for joining and documenting all of this, Felipe?
Thank you, Miguel. Well, first of all, my personal reasons for documenting the Venezuelan exodus. I'm a documentarian photographer, and I've been working for over 10 years. As such, I am also an immigrant. My family and I left Ecuador in 1999 as a result of the crisis there. We came to the United States. I have Venezuelan family, so the crisis is also close to the family's heart. And yes, for me, I started covering the crisis the middle of 2018 when the biggest or the first large wave of Venezuelans started arriving in Ecuador. I was in Ecuador, and we started, at first trying to help out, and also as a photographer, I was trying to document the situation. And that's when, we started hearing all these stories that were tremendously sad, but also very hard to grasp, right? Like what was happening in Venezuela, that so many people were arriving, hundreds every day were arriving, and listening to the stories of why they left and what were the factors that pushed them, and hearing these crazy stories of the money losing its value and not being able to buy food or fix very simple things to make a living. And then, of course, the conditions of people crossing essentially down the Andes, through Colombia, Ecuador, Peru, and even Chile.
And also, I think it's a real complex situation to join them in the walk, right? Because most of them feel really vulnerable and have a lot of fear. What's your biggest experience in that walking with them?
So I decided to join them in the walk, leaving Venezuela. So on the other side of the border in Cucuta, a large city in Colombia. And I decided to go all the way there and join them in the walk because they had, in a lot of the stories that they were telling of the road, they spoke of that first stretch as a particularly difficult one. First, just leaving their country with all kinds of uncertainty and weighing on them. Then in that part between Cucuta and then Bucaramanga, they go through these very cold highlands called the Berlin Highlands, and there's been people that have died there. It's below freezing temperatures at night, so for a lot of Venezuelans that come from very hot weather, crossing that is very difficult. That being said, in my experience, it wasn't difficult to join them. I think that my role there as a photographer was very much understood, was to a great extent appreciated, and I almost did not have any negative reactions to me being there and just walking. I was walking with them. If they hopped on a truck and they left, okay. If I managed to, if I stayed back, that was a problem for me. So by being with people, you create links very quickly.
Thank you, Felipe. And to speak a little bit about the violation of human, economical, social, and political rights, I think those are one of the main causes of the Venezuelan migration. Carolina, in your job, you have to see and closely investigate the constant violation of the human rights of the Venezuelans.
Well, I think Venezuela is facing what you could call a perfect storm. On the one hand, as you were saying, there is a very serious economic crisis, and this is something that is a very well established fact in the international community. Venezuela has the highest inflation rate in the world. We know that the economic crisis has sadly created higher levels of poverty for the population, and we are currently in a situation where the World Food Programme, in its latest report on the country, provided incredibly alarming data. 1 out of 3 Venezuelans can be considered food insecure, right? So we're describing a country that 10, 50 years ago had made some progress against poverty and against inequality, and that nowadays has some of the worst socioeconomic indicators of the entire region. Now, on top of that, you also have a crisis regarding civil and political rights. At least since 2014, when we saw perhaps one of the first major wave of social unrest and protests, we started documenting, very serious human rights violations in terms of extrajudicial executions, arbitrary detentions, torture, and other forms of ill treatment. So it isn't surprising in a way that people have seen fleeing the country as the only option they have for survival. Correct? And we believe that in a country where, massive violations of human rights are happening, those who flee the country should be considered people in need of international protection.
Thank you, Carolina. Only to help giving context to what you have explained, in the last years, the special security forces called FAES have killed almost 8,000 people in extrajudicial killing. Most of them are in the poorest neighborhoods, in the poorest slums, where the people doesn't have any kind of opportunity or any way to exercise their rights. In addition to this, Andrew, now in your experience as president of the Migration Policy Institute, an organization that seeks to improve the immigration and integration policies, what are the difficulties that the host countries have in implementing their public reception policies due to the overwhelming number of Venezuelan refugees right now?
One of the big challenges that people face is having legal status, some form of protection when they arrive. And countries have been generous. We've seen Colombia and Peru do temporary residency programs. Ecuador has now done this. Chile, for a time, was allowing people to arrive and then get work visas. So there's been a generosity in taking people in, but these programs haven't kept up with the demand. And so you now have a situation where probably less than half of the Venezuelans have some sort of legal status. Secondly, work, obviously, finding a space in the labor market. Overall, this is a fairly educated population coming out of Venezuela. It depends on which country, but beyond Colombia, the Venezuelan population looks more like the Colombian population. In Trinidad and Tobago, maybe slightly less well educated than the native population, but in most other countries, in Ecuador and Peru and Chile, Argentina, Uruguay, Mexico, the Venezuelan migrants and refugees who arrive actually have higher levels of education than the native-born population. This is a very well-educated population. They have college degrees, they have technical degrees, they have experience in business, but getting into the labor market, getting their credentials recognized in ways that allow them to move into the professions that they exercise in Venezuela has been very hard and very slow in most countries. And simply finding niches in economies that are already precarious, right? I mean, people are moving into countries that have large informal markets.
I think, Felipe, you have a real vivid experience about the worst part of what I think is the worst part of the Venezuelan refugee situation.
The first anecdote is what motivated this work. I was covering the arrival in Ecuador. This is in, middle of 2018. And I had seen in photos, and I had seen, the bolívares, the currency folded into little origami or into bracelets. I had seen that, I had seen photos of that, but it wasn't until I was there, and I remember this 9 or 10-year-old little girl that gifted me this little origami made out of a, 100 Bolivar bill. That really struck me, right? And that's why, after walking with the caminantes, I decided to transfer the photos on top of the Venezuelan bolívares into these collage-looking images. So that's the first anecdote, and the second anecdote is it was the first day that we had just left Cucuta, and we had been walking for a few hours. And most of the people there had been extremely welcoming and extremely, just showing a lot of solidarity with each other. If somebody had some water, if somebody, had heavy bags, if somebody had kids, and there was a lot of solidarity, and there was quite a lot of good energy between the people walking along the road. And me with my camera, I was quite well received until we found a group that was resting, and there was one woman that was quite defensive right off the bat. When she saw me and with a camera, and of course I wasn't going to go in and just photograph everybody. First, I approached them and we were talking to them, but she was quite defensive, and she had a baby in her arms wrapped in a blanket, and we didn't really understand why she was so defensive with us. And then as she was talking, the baby's little leg kind of like slipped through the blanket, and it must have been a recently born baby. But the baby's leg was the size of my thumb, right? The thickness of my thumb. And that's really what hit me. What I realized that a lot of these people had been going through.
What you're saying about this experience with this mother, sadly, is the experience of a lot of mothers right now. In Venezuela, the whole humanitarian emergency in Venezuela have a differential impact in women's, and especially in mothers and in newborn kids that are totally unfair. And thank you for sharing that story with us, and trying to link this a little bit with what Carolina said before. And I want to go back with her and about we're receiving reports, Carolina, about how the xenophobia are increasing in the countries who are receiving the Venezuelans. What do you think should be the efforts of the countries and the organizations, and even from the Venezuelans to address the xenophobia, and how to also not only get over the xenophobia, also how to get inserted in the whole system as one more in the country? Carolina.
Yes, well, you are very right. I think we are receiving, a lot of different reports coming from different countries about xenophobic reactions, both from host communities, but also from, political leaders. in Peru and in Colombia, I'm sure that many people who study the situation of Venezuelans in South America saw videos of Venezuelans being evicted because of the pandemic. We know that many people lost their jobs, not just Venezuelans, of course, also vulnerable Peruvians and Colombians and Chileans. But certainly, when you are a foreigner, being evicted increases your vulnerability, because probably foreigners don't have the same support networks that nationals of a country have. So when people were evicted in Peru, for example, or in Colombia, many were forced to return to Venezuela. So this current emergency, the pandemic has created a situation in which many people are being forced to return to a country that they were forced to flee, and this certainly creates new challenges for different governments across the region. What really concerns me a lot is political xenophobia. We have, especially at the major level, we have mayors in Colombia, for example, that as soon as the pandemic started and quarantine measures were taken, they closed shelters devoted to secure, a place for refugees to eat or to sleep overnight. They also made public, statements around refugees not being allowed to enter their cities, like the mayor of Pamplona in Colombia, for example, because they needed to protect the population from people on the move, etc. So yes, we need to address, the challenges that host communities face when they have many Venezuelans coming into the communities and resources are scarce, etc. The clear challenges there. But what is definitely very unacceptable is that political leaders at different levels use the situation for political gains, and they build fear, and they build a narrative that makes it easier for people to discriminate.
I think, Andrew, hearing this, I want to ask you, this is a two-way question. First, what do you think are the biggest challenge the host countries have right now to get over these kind of situations? And also, I think the vulnerability of the Venezuelans and the complex humanitarian emergency we're facing inside of the country are also opening another phenomenon, that is the human trafficking. And we're starting to have notorious networks of human trafficking, mostly to the Caribbean island, mostly aiming to women's in between the 20s and the 30s. And I think that's also part of this phenomenon, and I think it's not well spotted yet. Most of the world are not understanding what's happening with this human trafficking and how this is increasing in Venezuela.
Let me start by saying, I one of the reasons I love Felipe's photos and they're so powerful is I think he manages to capture two things at the same time that are true. And one is the vulnerability of people that are leaving Venezuela in very precarious circumstances, and the strength of the people that are leaving. And those sound contradictory, but they're both true at the same time, right? People are leaving in immensely vulnerable circumstances, but they also are leaving with hope and strength and a determination to start over. And the first time I saw them, that has stayed with me, and I've gone back to the photos multiple times because I think it's a very powerful representation of what we're seeing. One thing we know about migration in general, and about Venezuelan migrants in particular, is that there's an incredible opportunity to take advantage of people who are innovative, entrepreneurial, and ready to start their lives over again. And that, yes, there is vulnerability. People do need a leg up. They do need a way of being included in the healthcare system. They need legal documents. They do need help navigating a new country that they've landed in. But they're also ready to give it their all in starting their life anew, and that's an opportunity.
What you're doing, Felipe, I think is a real important work, because you are giving in images the whole explanation of a real complex situation. How you do it? How you choose it? How is this process?
This question of how does one photograph, how does one document a crisis is one that I've asked myself since I picked up a camera for the first time. I think that as photographers, we have when we photograph crises and migration crises, whether it's the Venezuelan or in Central America or a refugee crisis in the other side of the world, we really have to give our best to give the most honest representation of what's going on. We really have to do our best at showing the people that are going through this with all their dignity. We really have to do our best as photographers, as journalists, to represent adequately the situation. Now, as a photographer, as photographers, we're constantly, I think, we're constantly faced with the fact, with the problem of how do I make an image that is seen, that is seen, and that it stops people and makes people think, because everybody's a photographer now. Everybody takes images. We consume thousands of images every day on your phone, on Instagram. You put like or you don't, and then you move on, right? And I think there's a tremendous amount of photographers, photojournalists, documentary photographers out there documenting crises in very strong ways. Some of them work with the people that they are documenting, so that the people have a voice in the process. Other people include video, include sound. So there's different tools of making sure that you get a complete picture. In my case, I wanted to reproduce the impact that little origami figure made out of a 100 Bolivar bill had on me. That made me stop in my tracks and question what was going on, what was happening to the economy, and what were the implications it had on people's lives. So I decided to go down that path, and eventually I started combining the images of the caminantes with these bills that actually happen to be quite colorful and beautiful and making patterns. So it ended up being these very compelling images that speak of the crisis, the causes, the push factors, and also about Venezuela as a country, and a long history that they've had in terms as a strong country.
And thank you for using the word dignity, because I think one of the hardest part for the migrant and for the vulnerable people is sometimes they feel most of the people doesn't respect and doesn't understand the dignity they want to preserve. And thank you for using that as a keyword. I don't want to close this conversation without giving the opportunity to Andrew and to Carolina to give a brief closing remarks. If you want to say anything else or to add something to the conversation, please, Carolina, and after Andrew, the floor is yours.
I think I want to close by also thanking Felipe for his work, because it is indeed, as he was saying, it is never easy to photograph, to produce images of people who are vulnerable and who are fleeing.
Thank you, Carolina. Andrew?
I mean, these are powerful pictures of people with great dignity, and at the same time are leaving a horrific situation. I mean, they are forced out of their country, what once was a proud country, a proud, successful country, and they've been forced to leave it. But they've taken that pride with them and that dignity with them. But that contrast is to the official money, right? Is to what's left of the officialdom behind them. And it really is the sense that this is what was the government has been rendered worthless. What was the officialdom in Venezuela? The pride is still there. The dignity is there. The honor is there for being Venezuelan. But what is left of officialdom, of a state that should be protecting them, is no longer worth anything. And they're abandoning the country because of that. And I think that's a powerful image.